Hello, everybody. This is the second competition lecture. And a discussion about competition wouldn't be good without talking about the competitive exclusion principle. Now, we've talked a little bit about this. I just want to hit it up again while we're talking about the competition. The competitive exclusion principle was really done in reference to some famous experiments done by Gauss, where they looked at um, populations populations and communities of these paramecium species that were grown together. Now, when you grow Aurelia separately, it does really good. When you grow Caudatum alone, it grows really good. There's a whole lot of individuals. But now in a mixed population, we see Aurelia does not grow as much. There's fewer individuals per volume. But Caudatum then eventually um, their population starts to grow and then eventually goes to extinction. Now, from these experiments, what we kind of got was this idea that if two organisms have the same niche, they will not coexist. Essentially, um, a one individual is one individual species, I should say, is always a better competitor than another one. Okay. Now, how do then we get species coexisting, right? And that the answer is, well, there's a variety of answers, but one of the most simple answers is their niches slightly differ. Okay. So when those researchers, the same researchers that were doing the paramecium caudatum and Aurelia, when they changed the conditions of their little vials, what we saw is one of them grew down in the more oxygen poor um, environment at the bottom of the test tube, and then the other species grew at the top where there was more oxygen. So, the niches showed that the blue one here in this case has a higher tolerance for low oxygen as opposed to the purple one. So their niches were slightly different. And we'll talk about some other ways in which we get coexistence, even if two species would essentially have the same niche. These classic competitive exclusion experiments were also kind of redid in terrestrial plant world, or sorry, with aquatic diatoms. What they found is a lot of really the same stuff, where you eventually get one species essentially going to extinction. So you might ask, well, what makes a good competitor? How is a species? Why is one species better at competing for a specific resource than the other? Now, in at least the animal world, what we see is larger species often do a better job. They often win in competitions. And that's because they're better able to do interference competition, right? The larger, the more massive an organism is, the stronger it's going to be, which will allow it to win in a classic, like aggressive territory defense or something. And then we also see larger species win when there's exploitative competition going on. Because think about an elephant competing with a grasshopper over leaves on a tree. There's a greater per capita impact from the elephant. What that means is, one individual can have a much, much bigger impact of one species compared to the other. So when an elephant takes one bite, it eats, a good portion of the tree. Whereas a grasshopper taking one bite is essentially going to do nothing, right? So what we often see is larger species will oftentimes win in competition. Activity levels then. More active species means that they'll do more foraging, which means they'll do more resource depletion and be able to hoard resources better for their own species, and the energy from that resource will go into the more active species as opposed to the less active, lazier species that doesn't do much. But maybe that strategy doesn't always work. Maybe there's a strategy where species that can be the most efficient, where they can grow and increase their population at the lowest resource supply rate. So maybe think about that where plants. Okay, plants need each individual species of plant needs a specific amount of nitrogen, and they as they're growing, they'll deplete those nitrogens at the nitrogen level until they might actually start outcompeting others by limiting the nitrogen enough for another species. What we should remember, though, is that just because one organism wins is a good competitor in one area and wins in that area doesn't mean it's a good competitor in a very different type of area. And that's very clear when we're thinking about algae, okay, with nutrient competition, or sorry, algae in competition in lakes. So what we see is in like a super clear lake, the organisms are not um, light limited, and they'll need to compete for nutrients. And the best way to compete for nutrients is to be super small, because you can then be more efficient with your nutrients that you get and grow. Um, and that allows the really, really small algae to do well in clear lakes. But in a really eutrophic lake, where there's essentially just a soup of nutrients, where they don't need to worry about competing for nutrients, all they need to worry about is competing for light. So the bigger you are, the better you're able to soak up that light and not let anybody else have it. So we see larger algae dominate in eutrophic conditions or nutrient-rich conditions. So what makes you a good competitor in one area might make you a bad competitor in another area. So who is competing most strongly? What type of organisms will compete with each other like more often? Now, one way that we can think of this is with niche overlap, okay? Where let's say we have three species here: a blue, a green, and a yellow species, right? Now, given these niches, you might expect the blue and the green to compete more strongly, because there's, this area. This is the area where the blue and the green will compete with each other. Because they're able to occupy the same area. Let's say these are the fundamental niches, right? They're able to occupy the same area and potentially be competing with each other much more strongly than these two, the green and the yellow, because there's essentially no or there's a little bit, but not very much overlap in their niches. So this is really tricky, though, and it's been interpreted in two different ways. One way, and this is the Hairston, in a 1980 paper he wrote, was looking at that high niche overlap results in intense competition, kind of just what we were talking about. And they kind of had that view that we'd expect the blue and the green to be more strong competitors, because they have this high niche overlap, and these are areas in which they can compete. However, later on, people have very different interpretations of that, because what we might actually see is that a low overlap could potentially be a consequence of past competition, and might mean that they're actually really strong competitors, but now, since they don't have very much overlapping species, the niches, that might show that there was competition in the past. So when we think about, though, how competition and relatedness goes together, you might think that congenerics. So what that means is species that are in the same genus, but differ by species. Um, the most closely related species might be expected to have similar niches and be using the same resources, essentially. But that's a little tricky, because potentially resource partitioning has already been complete. So these are examples of warblers, and these are congeneric warblers that, while they are the same genus and use the same tree, they use different portions of the tree. So this bay-breasted warbler uses the middle of the tree, where the Cape May warbler does the top of the tree, only inhabits the top of the tree. And this is an example of resource partitioning, where they've partitioned or split up this tree into different areas, and different species use that. So it might not actually be competing at all here. And it might be that unrelated species are actually more will compete more strongly with each other because they might not have had as much coevolutionary history, and there's a potential for a large niche overlap with little niche partitioning and little resource partitioning. So when species do compete, one of the what happens, right? And what we see is niches can essentially shift over time. So um, you would expect if two species are very strongly competing with each other, natural selection would select for individuals that don't lose as much fitness due to that competition, right? So if one individual is continuously getting outcompeted, that organism's genes are probably going to go away. So what that means then is the niche can gradually change and shift over time. The great, a really good example is Joseph Connell's work, where he looked at these different um, barnacles, and you found that the blue barnacle, the Balanus and Cathamalus, whatever, we'll just say blue and the brown barnacle, right? Um, where the brown barnacle has a fundamental niche that encompasses this whole high tide and low tide range, but the blue barnacle outcompetes it um, at the lower tide levels. Okay, and then its physical tolerances don't allow it to go more than that because it's too dry for the blue barnacle. So the realized niches that are split, or at least the realized niche of the brown barnacle is split to the upper portion of the intertidal zone. And you might think that if the brown barnacle is continuously always relegated to having its realized niche be the top upper portion of the high tide, it might like in the future, now this is looking ahead due to evolution, which you really shouldn't do, but in the future, what could happen potentially is that the brown barnacle loses its ability to have its fundamental niche be down here, and the niche might shift just to being up in the upper portion of the high tide. So the organism can be more specialized and do a better job um, at that individual area. We can think of this as the realized niche eventually becomes the fundamental niche, because that unused ability is lost through natural selection. Another thing we see, another consequence of competition is character displacement. Okay, now this is difference in generally morphological traits, so body shape traits that we see, um, and Um, before I should talk about this, I really want to talk about the word sympatry versus allopatry. Sympatry means grown together, allopatry means grown apart. And what we see is there's this really classic example from the finches of the Galapagos Islands. When there's three of these finches grown in the same island on Santa Cruz, we see their beak depth. The beak depth is this from here up to here, right? So we can see this species has a much bigger, deeper beak than this species. Now, when you grow them all together, we see this really stark differences in their traits, right? Fortis has a much deeper beak than uh, Feligino, right? Feliginosa, sorry. Um, but when the Feliginosa is um, grown on its own on the island of Los Hermanos, it's a little bit bigger. And the Fortis, when it's grown on the Daphne Island, it's much smaller than it was when they were grown in Sympatry. So what this is, what's it's this bullet point here: physical manifestation of resource partitioning. When beak depth basically correlates to how big a seeds you can crush. So the bigger, deeper beaked species will eat bigger seeds and be able to crack them open. And it creates um, this pattern we see called overdispersion, where traits are spread out more than you would expect when they're grown in sympatry. This is actually really, really hard to test. What you have to do is basically find all the finches on the Galapagos Islands and randomly create assemblages and see if you just um, find differences in how those traits are going, um, or how they're dispersed across whatever gradient you want to talk about. Um, and there's relatively few examples, or oftentimes what we think of as overdispersion is just a weird random assemblage that we see. But there is this really cool data set looking at canine teeth. Read about it in your textbook. Canine teeth in basically in the Middle East. Sorry, not canine. These are different cats. The caracal and the wildcat are, yeah, I forget what species these exactly are. But what they show is that there is very little overlap, much less overlap than we would expect, um, in how big their teeth are, which translates to basically them eating different types of species. And there's this really interesting way in which competition works, and it's this weird apparent competition. Okay, so apparent competition is where you have two non-competing species that it looks like they're actually competing because they're linked by a predator. Okay, so what's interesting to remind, or what you should remember about this apparent competition is that when these two species are sympatric without a predator, the abundance is regulated by interspecific density dependent mechanisms. So that's things like running out of food, or um, pathogens that can parasites that can get the population with that high density. However, when they're grown with a predator, when these two sympatric species, the predator is there, the predation rate is linked to the total prey abundance. Okay, so what you see is that more prey equals more predation, and what this ends up with is lower abundance for both species. So let's look at this picture here. It should explain this idea a little bit. Okay, so let's say we have two non-competing species, right? This is a snail. The snail eats algae on rocks. Let's say this is some sort of shrimp that eats, I don't know, some little worms in the sand. Okay. Now, there's a predator, an octopus here in this case. Now, because algae eater, worms in the sand eating, these, would never really compete over anything, right? But the predator um, feeds on both of these. Okay, so increase the abundance of the shrimp. It's a positive impact on the octopus. The octopus numbers increase. As those octopus numbers increase, then you get fewer and fewer shrimps, right? So, and the same thing happens over here, right? The pulpo. Sorry, that's a Spanish word. I for some reason thinking in Spanish. The octopus is going to be eating the snail also. And so what happens then is you get a negative interaction between the snail and the shrimp. Okay. And an increase in the number of snails increases the number of predators, which then decreases the number of shrimp, and vice versa. So when you actually grow the shrimp um, and the snail in the, I shouldn't say grow, when they are living with the octopus, they actually have lower numbers than they would if they didn't have the octopus. So what we see is one way to maybe explain this has to do with population cycles. So, oftentimes, what we see this is that famous hare and lynx data set that we've talked about several times. And what you see is when the hare goes up, the population of the lynx, the predator, follows behind it relatively closely. Okay, so we have an increase in the hare, the lynx then um, comes up because there's some lag time and the number of like when there's a lot of prey availability, it takes for a while for the lynx to then grow and have more baby lynxes, right? So if there is some sort of cyclical thing with the prey, what you might see is the predator having some sort of cycle behind that, with that little bit of lag time. Um, so what this allows then is, basically all these lynxes here are starving and going away, and then once you get to low numbers of lynxes, then the prey can rebound. Um, However, if you have another prey in there, another prey item in there, what it allows then is now, I kind of put these offset. Um, it wasn't trying to make them completely, where there's a valley in the black, there's a peak in the yellow. But, you know, you could imagine that this just happens randomly. And also they could be somewhat linked or whatever. But what we see then is the predator number can be higher because there's basically this stable source of prey, right? Like basically you've got high numbers of prey here and here. Well, here it's a little low, so we might see the predator go down. But what you can have is support higher numbers of predator with more species of prey. So it shows this apparent competition. That's what can happen um, when you have these non-competing species, but actually get linked by this predator. Another kind of like side story about competition is this idea of amensalism. Okay, this is where two species interact, but um, one species gets a negative effect, and the other species essentially has no effect. We can think of this as like extreme asymmetric competition, where one species has that super strong negative effect and the other species again has no effect. So think about some little caterpillars here on a tree, okay, and they're going to be eating the leaves, but elephants are also going to be eating the leaves on the trees, and the elephant does not care whether there's a caterpillar there. Maybe there could potentially be some exploitative competition going on, but there's certainly some interference competition on the sense of the elephant affecting the caterpillar, but there's really going to be no effect of the caterpillar on the elephant. In fact, it might just get eaten up with the leaves. So the problem with amensalism is it's kind of a largely um, theoretical idea. You can see it. There's examples of it, but whether there's really a huge effect of amensalism on from a competitive standpoint is a little hard to say yes or no, and that's because the small effect is lost in statistical noise, right? So maybe there is certainly um, the elephant can have a negative effect on the caterpillar. But is that caterpillar actually having an effect on the elephant? I mean, you could imagine that the more the caterpillar eats, the less leaves are available to the elephant. So in some senses they are, but that super tiny effect of those couple caterpillars might just be lost in the statistical noise that you would see. And most of the studies that are going out to try to detect invincibilism are really have relatively small sample sizes. So one thing I want to talk here before finishing up is um, people in the past have kind of criticized the idea of competition or as um, whether it's actually important in nature. Okay, so if you look at like review papers, several big review papers. Were both done in the 80s, but there's hasn't really been that many competition review papers recently. Partly because they kind of the idea is kind of settled that competition does matter, right? And it does matter, but the answer is like how important it is. And these review papers said, 90% of 164 studies showed that competition existed. 83% of 54 studies showed that competition existed when they were going out to search for it. The issue is that this is a really tricky thing. Like you can't just say that looking at all papers that we're looking for competition, um, you know, are representative of whether competition is important or not. And it's probably because imagine if you're in someone's lab, like you go to graduate school and you're in someone's lab that they're an ecologist that's looking for competition. Well, you know what? Your eventual PhD dissertation or master's thesis is probably going to go and use a system that looks for competition and where competition actually exists. So it's hard to say, how much competition is actually going on in studies. And one way you can kind of get at that is these funnel plots. These are these weird kind of uh, plots that show whether there's missing data or not. So this is a symmetric funnel plot, which this is what you would expect if the studies are fair and unbiased. Okay, so if you see there's precision of the um, study on the y-axis and effect size on the x-axis. And what you can do is when you plot this, if the dots generally kind of follow this pyramid shape, right? The more precise you are, and generally the less effect size you'll find. But if there's any like big holes, like in here, um, this is showing that there's bias in the data. So if these were using a review paper for one of these those review papers. I suspect that this was what the funnel plot would look like in a lot of um, these papers. And this is saying essentially here that there's a negative effect or like that there is no competition. So that's what I just wanted to make you aware that like while competition is probably an important thing, there's probably a lot of bias in saying that how important it is in the whole